They sold 3 girls for the price of a mule and called it justice. Their father wasn't cold in the ground before the paperwork was signed. Land seized, names erased, futures auctioned off to men with ink-stained fingers and no conscience to speak of. Black Hollow watched. Black Hollow said nothing. And the Vale sisters, Marin, Sylvie, and little Tessa, were loaded onto a wagon heading nowhere good, with nothing but each other and a fury too hot to die quietly. This is the story of what happened when the Forgotten decided they were done being forgotten. Like and drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. Black Hollow, 1883. The morning Harlan Vale died, the sky over Black Hollow turned the color of a bruise. It wasn't the kind of death that came with ceremony. No church bells, no gathering of neighbors with covered dishes and heavy eyes. Harlan went the way a lot of men went in frontier towns, quietly, confusingly, in a way that raised questions nobody seemed particularly interested in answering. He was found at the bottom of the ravine behind his property, his horse grazing calmly nearby like nothing had happened, like the world hadn't just tilted sideways for 3 girls sleeping a quarter-mile away. Marin was the one who found him. She was 19 and had been awake since before dawn, the way she always was, already thinking about what needed doing, the water, the mending, the accounts her father kept badly, and she kept better. She'd gone looking for him because he hadn't come in for breakfast, and Harlan Vale, whatever his faults, was a man who ate breakfast. She found him in the shallow creek bed, face down, one boot missing, and she stood there for a full minute before she understood what she was looking at. She didn't scream, she didn't cry, not right then. She just turned around and walked back to the house with long, mechanical steps, pushed open the door, and said, "Girls, get up. Something's happened." Sylvie was 17 and still half asleep, her dark hair matted on one side. Tessa was 12 and had been reading under her blanket with a stub of candle, even though she'd been told 100 times not to. They both looked at Marin's face and understood without being told that nothing would ever be quite the same again. Harlan Vale had not been a rich man, but he hadn't been poor either, not by Black Hollow standards. He owned a stretch of land that ran along the northern ridge. Nothing spectacular to look at, mostly scrub and rocky pasture, but it was his, paid for with 12 years of work and a deed registered clean with the county. He'd raised 3 daughters on that land after their mother died of fever when Tessa was still in diapers, and he'd done it without complaint, which was more than most men would have done. The land, Marin would later learn, was the whole problem, but she didn't know that yet on the morning she stood at the edge of her father's creek and felt the ground shift under her feet. What she knew was simpler and worse. They were alone. The men from the county land office arrived 4 days after the burial. There were 2 of them, a thin, dry man named Aldous Peck, who carried a leather satchel and spoke in the clipped, precise way of someone who'd learned to use words as weapons, and a larger, quieter man who stood behind him and said nothing but looked at everything. Peck introduced himself as a representative of the Black Hollow Land and Title Authority, which Marin had never heard of, and presented a set of documents that he said pertained to the outstanding debts of one Harlan Vale, deceased. Marin read every word. She read them twice. "These numbers are wrong," she said. Peck smiled the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I assure you, Miss Vale, everything has been verified by—" "My father didn't owe $300 to anyone," Marin said. "He told me every account he carried. He was careful about money, careful enough that these numbers don't match anything in his ledgers." "Frontier records can be incomplete," Peck said pleasantly. "His ledgers are right here." Marin put her hand flat on the table. "Would you like to see them?" The quiet man behind Peck shifted his weight. Peck's smile didn't change. "Miss Vale, I understand this is a difficult time, but the law is quite clear. In the absence of a male heir, outstanding debts against property. We are the heirs," Marin said. 3 of us. That's settled in the will." "The will is being contested," Peck said, "by a creditor with legal standing. Until the matter is resolved, contested by who?" Peck paused just long enough to be telling. "I'm not at liberty to say." Sylvie was standing in the doorway to the kitchen. She was watching Peck the way she watched animals she didn't trust. Absolutely still, absolutely focused. Tessa was sitting at the table pretending to do something with her hands, but Marin could see her listening to every word. How long does resolution take? Marin asked. It can vary, Peck said. These things can be lengthy. In the meantime, the property is held in escrow. You'll need to vacate within... He checked a document with a small theatrical pause. 10 days. The room went very quiet. 10 days, Marin repeated. The authority can arrange temporary placement for you and your sisters, Peck said, in the same tone someone might use to discuss livestock arrangements. There are ranches in the county that take on domestic workers. It would be structured as a labor agreement. Until the legal matter. You're talking about selling us, Marin said. Peck blinked. I wouldn't characterize it that way. I would. He stood up, gathered his papers, resettled his hat. The quiet man was already at the door. 10 days, Miss Vale, Peck said. I'd encourage you to be practical about this. He left. The door closed. And Marin stood in the middle of the room she'd grown up in and felt something harden in her chest like cement setting. A cold, permanent anger that would not leave her for a very long time. They tried everything. Marin went to the sheriff's office and laid the ledgers on Deputy Hollis's desk and walked him through every line. Hollis was a decent enough man, slow and uncomfortable, and he listened to her with the expression of someone watching a flood and wondering whether to move. He said he'd look into it. He said she should give it time. He said these things were complicated. She went to Reverend Callum, who had known their family for years and baptized all three of them. He listened with his hands folded and said he would pray for them and perhaps speak to some of the congregation members about the situation. She went to Judge Ferris, who had a reputation for fairness, only to be told the judge was occupied and she should leave her concerns in writing. She wrote. She got no answer. Sylvie went a different route. She started talking to people, in the dry goods store, outside the church, at the well. She was naturally easy with people in a way Marin wasn't, warm and direct without being obvious about what she was doing, and she was trying to find out if anyone else in Black Hollow had run into Aldous Peck and the Land and Title Authority. What she found was uncomfortable. 3 families in the last 2 years had lost land under similar circumstances, debts that appeared from nowhere, documents that materialized after a death, legal machinery that moved very fast in one direction. One family had left town. One had taken a labor arrangement on a ranch out east. The third, the Moreau family, who'd had a farm up near the North Pass, had apparently disputed their eviction and then almost immediately stopped disputing it. Nobody knew exactly why. Their place now belonged to a man named Calhoun Briggs. Calhoun Briggs. Marin wrote the name down. She'd seen it before. She went back through her father's papers, and there it was. A letter, undated, written in careful handwriting, from Briggs to Harlan Vale. She hadn't understood it when she first read it, after the funeral, grief making the words blur. She read it again now, carefully. It was an offer to buy the land, polite on the surface, but there was a sentence near the end that she kept coming back to. I trust you'll consider this matter seriously, Harlan. Opportunities have a way of closing when one waits too long. She sat with that letter for a long time. The 10th day came like a door slamming. Peck arrived at first light with 2 men she hadn't seen before, broad-shouldered, not the type who carried document satchels. They stood in the yard while Peck informed Marin, with the same pleasant efficiency he'd shown at their first meeting, that the authority had arranged placements for all 3 sisters. Marin had packed. She'd made herself pack, because she'd known this moment was coming and she wasn't going to let these men watch her scramble. 3 bags, 3 girls, everything that mattered. The ledgers were wrapped in oilcloth inside her bag, along with Briggs's letter. Where are we going? She asked. Peck consulted his papers. You'll be placed with the Garrick operation east of here. Your youngest sister. He glanced at Tessa, who was standing very straight in the way she did when she was scared. Has been matched to the Calloway Ranch, north. Marin went still. That's not the same place. No, Peck agreed. We stay together, Marin said, flatly, like it wasn't a negotiation. That's not possible in this case, Peck said. The arrangements were made to fit available positions. Then unmake them, Marin said. Find us one position, together. Miss Vale. She's 12 years old, Marin said. Her voice stayed level only because she'd decided it was going to. You are not sending my 12-year-old sister to a ranch 2 days north of us. That is not happening. One of the broad-shouldered men behind Peck took a single step forward. Just one. Just enough. Sylvie moved between him and Marin without thinking. She wasn't big. She was 17 and lean and not particularly frightening to look at, but she stood like she was planted, which was something. Peck put up a hand to stop the man. "Ladies," he said, measured, "I understand this is upsetting, but the arrangement is legal and it is binding. You can contest it through the courts, of course." "With what?" Marin said. "You've taken our land. You've taken our father's money. You've given us 10 days. Now you want to separate us, and you're suggesting we hire a lawyer?" Peck looked at her for a moment with something that might have been mild respect or might have been nothing at all. "I suggest," he said, "that you get in the wagon." Thus, they ended up at the Garrick Ranch together, all three of them. Not because of Peck's generosity, but because Marin flatly refused to move until a revised arrangement was produced. And the revised arrangement happened because Sylvie, in a moment of cold calculation that surprised even Marin, quietly told one of the broad-shouldered men that she had sent letters to 3 newspaper editors in the county seat describing everything that had happened to their family, and that those letters would arrive whether or not she was alive to confirm them. She hadn't, in fact, sent any letters. She'd been planning to, but hadn't had the chance. But she said it with such perfect calm that the man believed her, and he said something low to Peck, and Peck's pleasant efficiency developed a small crack in it, and 40 minutes later there was a revised placement document covering all 3 sisters at the same location. In the wagon, jolting east along a road that got rougher the farther they went from town, Tessa leaned her head on Sylvie's shoulder. Marin sat across from them with her bag in her lap and watched the terrain change and thought about Calhoun Briggs. "Are you scared?" Tessa asked Marin. Marin looked at her youngest sister, 12 years old, trying not to show fear, doing a decent job of it, their father's same stubborn jaw on a child's face. "Yes," Marin said. She'd decided a long time ago that lying to Tessa about things that mattered was a mistake. "Are you?" Tessa thought about it. "A little, but I'm also mad." "Good," Marin said. "Stay mad." The Garrick Ranch was a hard-working, joyless place. Fletcher Garrick was a heavy-set man in his 50s who seemed to view every living thing on his property, human or animal, primarily as something that could be doing more work. He wasn't openly cruel, which Marin supposed was the best she could say. He fed them. He gave them a room, small, 1 room for 3 people, with a warped floor and a window that didn't quite close. And he made clear within the first hour that he expected his money's worth from the labor arrangement and that he'd been promised capable workers. "I need the cook and the cleaning and the mending done," he said, without looking directly at any of them. "Laundry twice a week, and whoever can handle it will help with the feed runs." "What are we being paid?" Marin asked. He looked at her then. "That's between me and the authority." "It's between you and us," Marin said. "We're the ones doing the work." He stared at her for a long moment, then walked away without answering. That was how things worked at the Garrick Ranch. Questions got walked away from. Complaints went nowhere. There were 4 other workers, 2 men who slept in the bunkhouse, a quiet woman named Pearl, who had been there for 2 years and told them nothing about herself, and an older man named Dort, who limped and did small repair work around the property. None of them talked much. The kind of quiet that settles over people when they've learned that talking doesn't improve anything. Marin worked. She kept her head down and she watched everything and she worked. She needed to understand the shape of this place, the people who moved through it, the patterns of information. She kept Briggs's letter and the ledgers in the oilcloth package at the bottom of her bag, and at night, when Tessa was asleep and Sylvie was breathing slowly in the dark, she would lie awake and put pieces together in her head. Briggs wanted the land. Briggs had written to their father. Their father had refused. She was sure of it, because the land was never sold. Then their father turned up dead at the bottom of a ravine, and within 2 weeks a man named Peck arrived with debts that didn't exist and paperwork that had already been prepared. That wasn't coincidence. That was a process. That was something that had been arranged, which meant her father had been killed. She'd known it, or suspected it, since the morning she found him. But knowing something and letting yourself fully believe it were different things. And she hadn't let herself believe it until now. Until the distance from Black Hollow made it possible to see the shape of everything without grief fogging the view. She stared at the ceiling of the warped little room and felt the cement-hard anger settle in deeper and thought, all right then. Well, Sylvie moved differently than Marin. Where Marin organized and analyzed, Sylvie connected. Within 2 weeks of arriving at the Garrick Ranch, she knew Pearl's history. Widowed, debt-trapped, had been at 3 different ranches before this one, all through the same authority arrangement. She knew that Dort had a nephew in the county seat who worked at a print shop. She knew that the 2 bunkhouse men, Callum and Raid, were brothers from up north who'd come south looking for paying work and ended up in something that paid a great deal less than promised. The authority has placed people at maybe 8 ranches in this county, Sylvie told Marin one evening when they were in the kitchen after dinner, the others gone to bed. All of them through Peck. Pearl's heard of at least 4 other families who lost land the same way we did. All with the same debt story? Similar. Details different. Peck's name comes up every time. Sylvie pulled her hair back with one hand and leaned against the sink. And Briggs. He owns 3 of the 8 ranches. Not directly, through other names, but Pearl figured out it's him. Marin filed this. Garrick? Garrick doesn't own the ranch, Sylvie said. He manages it. Somebody else holds the title. She paused. Want to guess who? The answer settled in the room like a stone dropping into still water. We're working for Briggs, Marin said. We're working for Briggs, Sylvie confirmed. They looked at each other across the kitchen, the single lamp throwing uncertain light between them. We need more than what we have, Marin said. The ledgers prove Father's debts were manufactured. The letter proves Briggs had motive. But that's not enough to move a judge. We need something connecting Briggs to Peck in a way that shows the murders, not just the land theft. Murders, Sylvie said, not as a question, just testing the word. Father didn't fall into that ravine, Marin said. And I don't think the Moreaus stopped fighting out of a change of heart. Sylvie was quiet for a moment. So what do we need? Proof, Marin said. And to get proof, we need access to something we don't have access to. She looked at the ceiling, thinking, Dort's nephew, the one in the print shop. What about him? A print shop does official documents, Marin said. Legal papers. Records. If Peck has been filing fraudulent debt claims, there are originals somewhere. There are documents. Somebody printed them. Sylvie straightened. You think the nephew? I think we should find out, Marin said. Carefully. Tessa, for her part, was not idle. She was 12, which meant people consistently underestimated her, which she had long since learned to use. Ranch life required people to be everywhere. Fields, outbuildings, the front yard when supply wagons came through. And nobody paid much attention to a quiet girl who seemed to be going about her own business. She had started a journal. Not of feelings or impressions, but of facts. Who came to the ranch and when. What they talked to Garrick about. When money changed hands and what it seemed to be for, she had a sharp photographic sort of memory and a patience that didn't match her age, and she sat in corners and she watched and she wrote things down in the small, cramped handwriting she'd developed because her notebooks were small, and she made them last. One afternoon, about 3 weeks in, a man came to the ranch that she'd never seen before. He didn't come to the front door. He came to the back, around the outbuildings, in the mid-afternoon when Garrick usually sent most of the workers to the far field. He was tall, dressed plainly, and he moved with a kind of deliberate quietness that most people didn't have. The quietness of someone who'd learned it, not someone who was naturally soft. He spoke with Garrick for maybe 10 minutes in the yard behind the barn, too far for Tessa to hear, but she could see their faces. Garrick was uncomfortable, not scared exactly, but the way he stood, weight shifted back, arms crossed, eyes moving, was the posture of a man who didn't feel in control of a conversation and knew it. The man was watching Garrick with a kind of patient stillness. At one point, Garrick gestured toward the house, a quick, irritated gesture, like he was talking about something inside it. The man looked at the house for a long moment. Then he looked back at Garrick and said something, and Garrick's jaw tightened. Then the man left the same way he came. Tessa wrote down everything she'd seen. Description, time, the way Garrick acted after, distracted, quieter than usual at dinner, going to bed early. She wrote it all down and said nothing about it to her sisters yet, because she wasn't sure what it meant. But she filed it. Because Marin had said in the wagon, stay mad, and staying mad meant paying attention. November pushed cold across the valley, and life at the Garrick Ranch settled into a brutal rhythm. They were up before light. They worked until the light was gone. The room they slept in had a stove that Garrick permitted them to use, but fuel was rationed, and on the coldest nights Maren would wake up and find Tessa curled against Sylvie for warmth, both of them asleep, and she would check that they were breathing and then lie awake and think. She thought about Black Hollow, about the people who had watched them be taken and said nothing, about Reverend Callum folding his hands and praying, about Deputy Hollis and his uncomfortable expression, about the 3 families who'd been destroyed before theirs, about Harlan Vale's missing boot and the calm, unconcerned horse. She thought about Calhoun Briggs, whom she had never met, who had written her father a letter about closing opportunities and was now presumably living very comfortably on land that had belonged to people who could no longer complain about it. She thought about what it would take to make him answer for it. She was building something in her head, a plan or the skeleton of one. It was incomplete. It had gaps she couldn't fill from where she was, on a hard bed in a ranch managed by a man who worked for the person she needed to destroy. But the skeleton was there, and it was hardening. One evening, Sylvie came in from the laundry with cold, reddened hands and sat on the edge of the bed and said, "Pearl told me something today." Maren looked up from the ledger pages she'd been reading again. "What?" "There's a man people have been talking about," Sylvie said. "Not locally." She heard it from one of the supply men. "Someone's been asking questions in the county about the land arrangements, about the authority." "What kind of man?" "The kind," Sylvie said carefully, "that people in Black Hollow are apparently very uncomfortable about." Maren waited. "His name is Ronan Creed," Sylvie said. The name meant nothing to Maren. "Who is he?" "Pearl doesn't know exactly, but the supply man said he'd come through 2 towns east of here and that every saloon went quiet when he walked in, that he used to work frontier enforcement, the bad kind, I think, the kind that does whatever the job requires, but he's not doing that anymore, or something changed." Sylvie looked at her hands. "He's been asking about a man named Vale, about what happened to his land." The air in the room changed. "He's asking about father," Maren said. "Sounds like it." "Why?" Sylvie shook her head. "I don't know." Maren looked back at the ledger pages, her eyes moving over numbers she'd memorized. She thought about a man who made saloons go quiet, who'd done work on the frontier she didn't want to think too hard about, who was asking about a dead man's land. "We need to find out more," she said. "Pearl might be able to get a message to the supply man," Sylvie said. "If Creed is moving through the county asking questions, he might come this way eventually. Or we find him first," Maren said. Sylvie raised an eyebrow. "From here? We can't go anywhere, Maren. Garrick would notice," Maren said. "That's not the same as us being unable to move." She paused. "Dort's nephew, the print shop. I've been thinking about that. We need to move on it." Sylvie looked at her steadily. "You have a specific plan, or are you still building?" "Both," Maren admitted. "Building toward specific." She folded the ledger pages back into the oilcloth. "But I need you to do something for me." "What?" "Find out everything Pearl knows about Ronan Creed," Maren said. "Not what people say about why he's scary, what he actually does, what he actually wants." She met her sister's eyes. "A man who makes saloons go quiet might not be on our side. Or he might be the only person in this county who's looking at the same thing we're looking at." "Or both," Sylvie said quietly. "Or both," Maren agreed. "That's why we need to know more before we decide what to do with him." Wah. The cold deepened. The ranch settled under gray November sky. Pearl was cautious but willing, and the supply man came through on a Thursday, and questions were asked and answers came back slowly, piece by piece, the way information moves in places where people are careful. What they learned about Ronan Creed was this. He was somewhere around 35. He'd worked frontier enforcement for a firm out of the Eastern Territories that did the kind of work that legitimate law enforcement wouldn't touch. Debt collection with violence, eviction enforcement, the resolution of disputes in which resolution meant one party was no longer in a position to dispute anything. He was very good at it. He was also, from what the supply man had gathered, not doing it anymore, and nobody seemed entirely clear on why. What everyone agreed on was that he was in the county and he was asking about Harlan Vale, and he had come to Black Hollow specifically, and the town's response to his presence was the particular discomfort of people who had done something they would prefer not to be examined on. And he hadn't left. Tessa, listening to this from the doorway where nobody was paying attention to her, took out her notebook and wrote, "Man in Black Hollow, name Ronan Creed, asked about father. Still there. Why?" Then she added in her small, careful letters, "Tall man at the ranch, 3 weeks ago. Careful quiet. Watch the house." She looked at what she'd written for a long moment. Then she wrote one more line. Same person? She didn't know. She had no way to know. But she'd learned from Marin that the right question was worth more than a premature answer, and so she wrote it down and kept it, and she stayed mad, and she kept paying attention. Outside, the wind picked up across the valley and rattled the warped window until the latch shook loose, and Marin got up in the dark to fix it, and the three sisters lay awake in the cold room for a long time before any of them slept. Somewhere out in Black Hollow, in a town that had watched them be sold and said nothing, a man with a dangerous reputation was asking questions about a dead man, and the dead man's daughters were starting to ask the same ones. Ronan Creed rode into Black Hollow on a Tuesday morning when the sky was flat white and the wind smelled like coming snow. He didn't make an entrance. That was the thing people got wrong about him later, when they retold the story. They added drama to his arrival that wasn't there. He came in on a gray horse that needed a rest, wearing a coat that had seen better years, and he tied up outside the saloon and went in and ordered coffee, not whiskey, which was its own kind of statement in a town like Black Hollow. But the saloon went quiet anyway, because someone recognized him, and that someone said his name low to the man beside him, and the name moved through the room in a ripple, and by the time Ronan had settled onto a stool with his coffee, 14 men had found reasons to be very interested in their own drinks. He noticed. He always noticed. He just didn't care particularly. The barman, a thick-armed man named Gus, who'd been pouring drinks in Black Hollow for 11 years and prided himself on knowing everyone's business, set the coffee down and said nothing, which was unusual for Gus. Ronan drank half of it and then said without preamble, "I'm looking for information about a man named Harlan Vale. Died about 2 months back, found in a ravine." Gus wiped the bar. "Tragic business," he said. "Accident," they said. "They," Ronan said. "Who's they?" "The deputy, the county man, Peck." Gus said the name the way you'd mention a smell you'd rather not identify. "You believe them?" Gus wiped the bar again, though it didn't need it. "I pour drinks," he said. "Believing things isn't my job." Ronan finished his coffee. "Where's the deputy?" Hollis, it turned out, was easier to find than to talk to. He was a man built for avoiding things. He had a round, evasive face and a handshake that left no impression, and when Ronan sat across from him in the small sheriff's office and laid out his questions plainly, Hollis did a remarkable thing. He answered every single one of them and said absolutely nothing. Yes, Vale had been found. Yes, it had been ruled accidental. Yes, there had been a land dispute afterward. Yes, Peck had handled the arrangements. Everything was in order. Everything had been done properly. Everything was fine. Vale had 3 daughters, Ronan said. "That's right. Where are they now?" Hollis folded his hands on the desk. "Placed with ranches east of here. Labor arrangements. It's standard when—" "Standard," Ronan said. "When there are debts and no male heir, the authority—" "How old are they?" Hollis paused. "The eldest is 19, I believe. The youngest—" Another pause, slightly longer. 12. 12, Ronan said, not angry, flat. Hollis looked at his folded hands. "The arrangements are legal," he said, and this time it sounded less like information and more like something he was telling himself. Ronan stood up. "I'm sure they are," he said, and left. He knew what legal meant on the frontier. He'd spent 8 years doing legal work for men who used legality like a fence, to mark the boundary between what they wanted and what anyone else could do about it. Legal meant the paperwork was right. It said nothing at all about whether the thing itself was right. He'd learned that lesson so thoroughly and at such cost that it had eventually made him unable to do the work anymore, which was not the kind of thing he usually explained to people. He went back to the saloon. He got another coffee. He sat in the corner and he thought about Harlan Vale. He'd never met the man. What he knew about him came from a single letter, a letter that had been mailed from Black Hollow 8 weeks ago and had found its way, through a chain of forwarded addresses, to a rooming house in Callaway, where Ronan had been staying while trying to figure out what to do with himself. The letter was from Harlan Vale. It said that he was being pressured to sell his land by a man named Calhoun Briggs, that he'd refused, and that he was worried about what would happen next. He said he'd been told Ronan had once worked enforcement for Briggs's firm, and that if there was anything Ronan knew about how Briggs operated that could help him protect his family, he would be grateful. The letter had arrived 11 days after Harlan Vale went into the ravine. Ronan sat with that for a long time in the corner of the saloon, the sounds of the room resuming cautiously around him, and he felt the particular weight of things that arrived too late. He'd had that feeling before. He'd been on the other side of it before. He'd been one of the men who arrived before things like letters, who made the letters unnecessary by making sure there was no one left to write them. He knew how Briggs operated because he'd helped Briggs operate for 3 years, and he told himself the things men tell themselves when the money is good and the work is just legal enough, and it's easier not to look too hard at the people on the other end of it. He wasn't doing that anymore. That was the short version. The longer version was worse, and he didn't visit it often. What he was doing was sitting in Black Hollow trying to figure out if he could do anything useful for 3 girls he'd never met, the daughters of a man who'd written him a letter that arrived too late and asked for help that he could have given if he'd been a different kind of person 8 weeks earlier. He ordered a 3rd coffee. Gus raised an eyebrow. Ronan ignored it. The thing about Calhoun Briggs was that he was not a stupid man and he was not a reckless one. He moved carefully. He used intermediaries. Peck was one. There were others. And he kept his own name off documents wherever possible. And by the time anything looked wrong, the wrong thing was already finished and the paperwork was already filed and the family was already on a wagon heading east. Ronan had watched him do this version of it twice, in different counties, for different parcels of land. Both times it had worked without a hitch, because the families involved had no resources and no leverage, and nobody in a position of power who thought they were worth fighting for. The Vale girls might be the same. That was the honest assessment. But Marin Vale, from what 2 days of careful questioning in Black Hollow had produced, was not the kind of person who accepted assessments. And there was the matter of what Ronan had seen, or thought he'd seen, when he'd gone out to the Garrick Ranch 4 days ago on the pretense of inquiring about feed prices. He'd seen a woman in her late teens standing at a window with papers in her hands, reading with the focused intensity of someone building a case. He'd watched her for maybe 30 seconds before she looked up, and their eyes met through the glass. And in that 30 seconds, he'd recognized something he didn't have a clean word for. A kind of cold, organized fury that wasn't grief and wasn't panic. It was the expression of someone who had already decided what they were going to do and was in the process of figuring out how. He'd looked away and finished talking to Garrick about nothing, and then he'd left, but he'd thought about it since. He was thinking about it now, in the corner of the saloon, his 3rd coffee going cold, when the door opened and the room did its quiet thing again, and Ronan looked up to see a man he recognized walking in. The man's name was Duval. He worked for Briggs, not as an intermediary, not as a paper pusher. Duval was the other kind, the kind Ronan used to be. He was a large man with a pleasant, forgettable face and a very particular way of moving through a room that broadcast clearly to anyone who knew the language that he was there to handle something. Duval didn't look at Ronan immediately. He ordered a drink, spoke to the barman, scanned the room in the practiced way. Then his eyes settled on Ronan and something moved across his face. Surprise. And then the careful blankness of a man deciding how to play a thing. He came over. He sat down without being invited. "Ronan," he said. "Duval," Ronan said. "Didn't expect to find you here." "I imagine not." Duval turned his glass on the table, slow. "You're asking questions around town." "I'm having coffee," Ronan said. "The questions are secondary." Duval smiled. It didn't do anything to his eyes. "Briggs knows you're here." "Good for Briggs. He's not happy about it." "I don't work for Briggs anymore," Ronan said. "His happiness isn't something I manage." Duval leaned forward slightly. Not threatening, not yet. Just reducing the distance between them, which was its own kind of message. "What are you doing here, Ronan? Honestly, whatever personal feelings you've developed about the nature of the work, this isn't a situation that needs 3 girls, Ronan said. Duval stopped. 12, 17, 19, Ronan said. Their father is dead, and they're on a labor arrangement they didn't agree to on a ranch that Briggs owns through two shell names. The youngest is 12 years old. He looked at Duval steadily. Is that the kind of work you want to defend to my face? Duval was quiet for a moment. Something moved through his expression that might have been discomfort, or might have been the memory of discomfort, which was the closest a man in his line got to it. Then he put it away. The arrangements are legal, he said. Yeah, Ronan said. Hollis said the same thing, word for word. Duval stood up. Briggs wants you to move on. That's the message. He doesn't want trouble with you specifically. You know how he is about people he's worked with. But if you keep pulling at this, it becomes a different conversation. Tell him, Ronan said, that I'll stop pulling at it when I'm satisfied that a man didn't get pushed into a ravine and his children didn't get sold to work on land he owned. Duval looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked up his glass, finished his drink, set it down. You've changed, he said. It wasn't a compliment, wasn't quite an insult. Just an observation, in the flat way of a man noting a change in weather. Most people do, Ronan said. Eventually. Duval left. The room let out a breath it had been holding. Gus came over and poured Ronan a fourth coffee without being asked, which was the closest the man came to a statement of solidarity, and Ronan accepted it. He sat there a while longer, thinking. Briggs knew he was here. That changed the timeline on things. Duval showing up wasn't a coincidence. The man had ridden out specifically, which meant Briggs had been watching Black Hollow, which meant Briggs was nervous, which meant there was something in Black Hollow still worth being nervous about. You didn't send Duval to deal with a situation that was already fully settled. You sent Duval when you thought the situation might become unsettled, which suggested the situation was less settled than it looked. He thought about Marin Vale and the papers in her hands and the look on her face through the glass. He thought about a 12-year-old girl on a labor arrangement she hadn't agreed to. He thought about a letter that had arrived 11 days too late. He left money on the bar for the coffee, nodded to Gus, and walked out into the flat white morning. He had some decisions to make about what he was willing to do and what it might cost, and he preferred to make them outside where the air was cold and honest. The saloon had followed him with its silence until the door closed behind him. By that afternoon, he'd made up his mind, or close enough to it. He went to the boarding house where he was staying, a narrow, drafty place run by a woman named Mrs. Aldrich, who asked no questions and charged fair rent, and he sat at the small desk in his room and wrote a letter. It was short, and it said less than he wanted to say, because he wasn't certain who else might read it before it arrived. He addressed it to Marin Vale, care of the Garrick Ranch, and he folded it and sealed it and paid a boy a nickel to carry it out east with the supply wagon that was leaving first thing in the morning. The letter said, I knew your father's name before I came here. I'm not your enemy. Don't decide yet whether I'm anything else. I'll be in Black Hollow for the next 2 weeks. R.C. It wasn't much. He knew it wasn't much. But he also knew from experience that the wrong first move could close doors permanently, and he needed Marin Vale to open a door, not shut one in his face. She was smart. Smart enough that a heavy-handed introduction would end things before they started. So he gave her information and let her use it however she was going to use it. And he went back to his room and cleaned his gun and stared at the ceiling and tried not to think about Harlan Vale's letter sitting in a forwarding pile in Callaway while its author was being tipped into a ravine. 2 days later, a reply came back on the supply wagon, written in small, neat handwriting on a scrap of paper that looked like it had been torn from a ledger page. It said, How did you know his name? How long did you know it before he died? No greeting, no signature. Just the questions, precise and cold, cutting right to the thing he'd been hoping she wouldn't ask first. He sat with that for a long time. Then he wrote back, Long enough that I should have come sooner. That's the honest answer, and I know what it cost me to give it. The next reply came faster. Same handwriting, same ledger paper, but longer this time. She told him what she had, the original ledgers, Briggs's letter to her father, Pearl's accounts of similar arrangements across the county, Dort's nephew at the print shop. She laid it out with no embellishment, just facts and gaps. And at the end she wrote, This isn't enough to move anyone with power. We know that. What do you know that we don't? Ronan read it 3 times. Then he sat back in his chair and felt something he hadn't felt clearly in a long time. Not exactly hope, but the recognition that the thing he was trying to do might not be impossible. The girl had been building a case from inside a labor camp with no resources and no freedom of movement. She had the intelligence of the ledgers in her father's letter. She had her sister's network. She had whatever the 12-year-old had been writing in her notebook. He'd spotted that on his visit to the ranch, the small figure in the doorway with her pen moving. What he had was different. He had 3 years of direct knowledge of how Briggs operated. He knew where the real documents lived, not the filed copies, but the originals, the ones that showed the actual instructions, the actual payments, the actual chain of command between Briggs and Peck, and the men who'd done the physical work of eliminating people who refused to cooperate. He knew the name of a man in the county recorder's office who had been taking money to file fraudulent claims. He knew that Duvall wasn't working alone, that there were at least 2 other men in the county on Briggs's payroll watching for problems. He also knew, and this was the part he wrote carefully, that Briggs would move soon. Duvall's visit had been a warning. Warnings were given when you thought they'd work. When Briggs decided they hadn't worked, he skipped the next warning and went straight to the resolution. Ronan had watched him do it. He knew the pattern. He wrote all of this. He wrote it carefully, in stages, because some of it compromised him directly, and he knew it, and she needed to know what she was dealing with when she decided whether to deal with him. He told her what he'd done for Briggs. He told her he'd stopped doing it, and why, though the why was incomplete, because some of it he still didn't have clean language for. He told her that Duvall showing up meant the clock was shorter than she thought. He sent the letter and waited. Her reply took 4 days, which was longer than the others. When it came, it was short again. It said, 2 weeks isn't enough time. We're not ready. But we might not get to pick our moment. Then, after a space, in slightly different pressure from the pen, like she'd stopped and come back to it. My sister thinks you were the man who came to the ranch. The quiet one. She described you. She doesn't miss much. Then, don't come to the ranch again. Garrick's noticed something, and Duvall has a man watching the road east. We need a different way to move. Ronan read this and looked out the window of his room at the gray sky over Black Hollow and thought, she's right, and she figured it out faster than I expected, and we have maybe 10 days before Briggs stops issuing warnings. He thought about the auction grounds at the north end of Black Hollow. Open, public, the place where property sales were conducted in front of witnesses. He thought about what it would take to get 3 women from a ranch 2 days east into that space with evidence in hand and enough people watching that Briggs couldn't simply make it disappear. It was a bad plan. It had too many moving parts and too many ways to go wrong, and it required things from people who didn't owe him anything and had every reason to be afraid. He started working on it anyway. Outside, the first snow of the winter was beginning to fall on Black Hollow, soft and steady, covering the frozen ground, covering the tracks left by men who'd rather not be followed. The plan arrived in pieces, the way all bad plans do, each piece looking almost reasonable on its own, the full picture only visible when you laid them all together and realized how many things had to go exactly right for any of it to work. Ronan's letter came on a Wednesday, tucked inside a grain invoice that Pearl had managed to intercept before it reached Garrick's hands. Marin read it twice standing up in the cold kitchen before anyone else was awake, then sat down at the table and read it a 3rd time because she wanted to be sure she hadn't misunderstood. She hadn't. He was proposing they go back to Black Hollow. Not run. Not hide. Not wait for some distant court to notice that 3 women were being held in a labor arrangement built on fraudulent debt. Back to Black Hollow, to the auction grounds. In public. With whatever evidence they had. In front of whoever could be gathered to witness it. She sat there for a long time with the letter in her hands, and the fire in the stove ticking quietly, and the snow still coming down outside, soft and indifferent. Sylvie found her there 20 minutes later, came in pulling her shawl tight, and looked at Marin's face, and then at the letter. What is it? Marin handed it to her without a word. Sylvie read it. Her expression didn't change much. That was one of her gifts, keeping her face neutral while her mind worked. But her hands tightened slightly on the paper. When she finished, she set it on the table and said, He's serious. He's serious, Marin confirmed. It's insane. Yes. Duvall has men watching the East Road. We'd have to get to Black Hollow without being seen, which means, what, through the North Pass? In December? Through the Moreau land, Marin said. Dort told me there's an old logging trail that cuts west, stays below the ridge. It's longer, but it doesn't cross any of Briggs's watched roads. Sylvie looked at her. You've been thinking about routes. I've been thinking about everything, Marin said, for weeks. Sylvie pulled out a chair and sat down. The kitchen was quiet around them, the rest of the ranch still asleep, that particular silence of early morning that felt borrowed, like it would be taken back any minute. And you think it works? Sylvie asked. Getting to the auction grounds, in front of witnesses, with what we have, you think that's enough to actually move something? I think it's the only move that can't be quietly buried afterward, Marin said. Everything else, letters to newspapers, county courts, complaints filed with officials Briggs probably already owns, those can disappear. But a public confrontation with documented evidence, in front of a crowd, with a man who worked directly for Briggs willing to testify, she stopped. That's harder to make go away. If Creed actually testifies, Sylvie said, he said he would. He said a lot of things in letters, Sylvie said, not unkindly. We've never actually met the man. Marin had thought about this too. I know, she said, but he told me things about himself that compromised him, things he didn't have to tell me. If he was working for Briggs, the smart move was to stay friendly and say nothing incriminating. He didn't do that. Sylvie was quiet for a moment, turning it over. Then, what does Tessa think? They both looked toward the doorway, because Tessa had a way of appearing in doorways. And sure enough, there she was, wrapped in her blanket, notebook in hand, having apparently been awake long enough to catch most of the conversation. She didn't look embarrassed about it. I think, Tessa said, coming to the table and sitting down, that we should go. She put the notebook on the table. I've been keeping track of Garrick's patterns. The supply wagon leaves Thursday morning before first light for the county depot. It goes west, which puts it on the road toward the Moreau land. She opened the notebook to a page near the back. If we're on that wagon, or near enough to it to use its tracks for cover, we'd have a 4-hour head start before Garrick notices we're gone. And it's Thursday, tomorrow. Marin and Sylvie both looked at the notebook page, then at their youngest sister. You've been planning a route, Marin said slowly. You weren't the only one thinking, Tessa said. She said it without attitude, just factually, which was somehow more affecting than if she'd said it with heat. Sylvie let out a breath that was almost a laugh, though nothing about the situation was funny. Right, she said. Okay. She looked at Marin. So we go tomorrow. We go tomorrow, Marin said. They sat in the kitchen for another hour, going through it. Tessa's route notes, Marin's ledger papers, and Briggs's letter. The account of Pearl's testimony about the other displaced families, the gaps that still needed filling. The piece Marin was most worried about was Dort's nephew. She'd sent a message through Pearl 2 weeks ago, asking if he'd look at the original filing documents for the Vail debt claim, to confirm whether they matched the printing style of other Peck documents. She hadn't heard back. Without that, the ledgers and the letter were suggestive but not conclusive. We go without it if we have to, Sylvie said. We might have to, Marin agreed, but Creed said he knows the man in the recorder's office who was taking money to file the claims. If that man can be put in the same room with what we have, that's a lot of ifs, Sylvie said. All of it is ifs, Marin said. That's not a reason not to go. Pearl knocked softly on the kitchen door just before 6, came in to start breakfast, and found all 3 sisters already there, papers spread across the table. She looked at the papers, then at Marin, then at the snow coming down outside. You're leaving, she said. It wasn't a question. Tomorrow morning, Marin said, before first light. Pearl nodded slowly. She was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that has weight in it. Then she said, the Calloway family. The ones I told you about that stopped fighting. The oldest son is at a ranch south of here. He'd talk if someone gave him reason to think talking was safe. She looked at Marin steadily. I don't know if you can use that, but I wanted you to have it. Marin wrote it down. Thank you, Pearl. Pearl nodded once, businesslike, and started on breakfast, and nobody said anything more about it. That night, Marin wrote one final letter to Ronan and paid Dort's youngest helper a coin to carry it to town the back way, with instructions to leave it at the boarding house with Mrs. Aldrich. It said, We'll be at the north end of the auction grounds at midday Saturday. We need the recorder's man there if you can manage it. And we need you to understand, we're not asking for rescue. We're asking for a witness who can speak to the things we can't prove ourselves. If that's not what you're offering, say so now. She sealed it, and let it go and lay awake most of the night going through contingencies, her mind running the same loops it had been running for weeks, checking gaps and angles and the places where things could break. There were too many. She knew there were too many. But the alternative was staying at the Garrick Ranch until Briggs decided the loose end was worth tying off properly, and that was no alternative at all. Sometime around 3 in the morning, Sylvie's voice came quietly out of the dark. "You're not sleeping." "No," Marin said. A pause. "Are we going to be okay?" Marin thought about answering honestly, and then decided the honest answer was not the useful one. "We're going to go," she said. "That's what I know right now." Sylvie was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's enough." They left before the supply wagon, not with it. Tessa's plan had been more cautious than Marin first understood, using the wagon's scheduled departure as cover for the window of confusion it would create, not as actual transport. They took what they could carry in the 3 bags they'd arrived with, left the room neat, out of some instinct Marin couldn't fully explain, and walked out into the pre-dawn dark with the snow crunching under their boots and their breath coming in small visible clouds. The logging trail was exactly where Tessa's notes said it would be, which struck Marin as both a relief and a thing that made her proud in a way she didn't have words for, that her 12-year-old sister had been quietly mapping their escape while nobody was paying attention to her. It was a hard 2 days of travel. Cold the whole time, the trail icy in places, the trees pressing close on either side and blocking whatever thin winter light there was. They had food Pearl had pressed into their bags without comment the night before, bread and dried meat, and a small jar of preserves that Tessa carried wrapped in her blanket. They slept a few hours the first night in the shelter of a rock overhang that cut the wind, huddled together for warmth, and in the morning pushed on without discussion. At one point on the second morning, Marin slipped on an iced-over section of trail and went down hard on one knee, tearing her stocking and raising a bruise she could feel immediately, hot and insistent under the cold. She sat there for a moment in the snow and felt the full weight of the situation sit on her, tired, cold, limping toward a plan that had too many gaps to be properly called a plan, heading to confront a man who had killed her father and had the legal and financial structure to make that completely unactionable. Sylvie reached down and pulled her up without comment, which was the right thing to do, and they kept going. They arrived on the outskirts of Black Hollow on a Friday evening, coming in from the north through the back of the Moreau property. Abandoned now, the house dark and cold, the fields gone to winter-brown stubble. Marin paused at the edge of the Moreau land and looked at what had been someone's home and farm, and felt the specific anger of seeing the pattern made visible. This was what Briggs did. This was the wreckage he left behind him. And then he filed the paperwork and moved to the next one. They found a place to shelter that night in a half-collapsed storage building at the property's north edge. It was drafty and smelled of old grain, and nothing about it was good, but it was out of the wind and hidden from the road. They ate the last of Pearl's bread and said very little and tried to sleep. Ronan found them at first light Saturday morning. He came the way he came everywhere, quietly and without announcement, though Tessa heard him before the others did and had already moved to the doorway by the time he appeared. He looked at her for a moment, this 12-year-old girl standing in a rotting doorframe with a notebook under her arm, and something crossed his face that wasn't quite a smile but was in the same neighborhood. "You're the one who spotted me at the ranch," he said. "You walked too quiet for someone who wasn't trying," Tessa said. "Normal people don't move like that." "Fair," he said, and then he looked past her to Marin, who was on her feet and watching him with an expression that was doing its best to be neutral and mostly succeeding. He was bigger than she'd expected from a letter correspondent and rougher looking, a face that had accumulated weather and some damage over the years, a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in several days, dark eyes that moved across the room in the same automatic assessment she recognized from years of watching her father look at unfamiliar terrain. She didn't find him frightening. She found him useful, which was its own category, and she was aware that the line between the two was something she needed to keep clear. "You got my last letter," she said. "I did," he said. "And?" "The recorder's man is named Bertram Cole. He was taking payments from Peck going back 18 months. I've been sitting on that information for 2 weeks because I needed to know how to use it, and this," he gestured vaguely at the space between them, "is how I decided to use it. Can he be at the auction grounds at midday?" "He'll be there," Ronan said. "He doesn't know that yet, but he'll be there." He paused. I also have 3 years of documentation on Briggs's operating methods. Names, dates, payments. I've been carrying copies since I left his employment. I'd planned to use them for other purposes, but they apply here. Marin looked at him. Why did you leave his employment? It was a direct question, and she asked it directly, and she watched him decide how to answer it. He could have deflected. He chose not to. There was a family in Hardin County, he said, similar to yours. The father refused to sell. Briggs sent me to resolve it. He stopped. I didn't resolve it the way Briggs wanted, and then I left. What happened to the family? Sylvie asked from the corner. She'd been listening the whole time. They lost the land, Ronan said. I stopped what was going to happen to the people, but I didn't stop the land seizure. I didn't know how to stop that part. He looked at his hands for a moment. I know more now. The room was quiet. Tessa was writing in her notebook. Marin noticed this and didn't stop her. All right, Marin said, here's what we have. She laid it out for him. The ledgers, the letter, Pearl's testimony about the pattern, the Calloway name Pearl had given her, Tessa's documentation from the ranch. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and she could see him fitting it against what he had, looking for the structure. It's enough, he said finally. With Cole's testimony and my documentation, it's enough to force an official inquiry. An inquiry in public, in front of witnesses, is something Briggs can't suppress. Can't suppress easily, Marin corrected. No, he agreed. Not easily, and he'll try. He looked at her steadily. Duval is still in the county. 2 other men I know by sight. Briggs may be here himself. I haven't confirmed that yet, but it would be in his pattern to be present for the auction proceedings. He paused. If he's there, it changes things. How? Tessa asked, without looking up from her notebook. He's harder to shame in absentia, Ronan said. If he's actually standing there when the evidence is produced, he stopped, thinking it through. It's better if he's there. Worse in terms of what he might do, but better for what you're trying to accomplish. What we're trying to accomplish, Marin said, is that he answers for what he did to our father and to the other families, not just loses a legal proceeding. She held Ronan's gaze. I need you to understand what this is for. It's not just about getting our land back. I know, Ronan said. Do you? He was quiet for a moment. He had your father killed, he said. And before your father, probably the Moreaus and maybe 2 other families I know about. Yes, I understand what this is for. He met her eyes. That's why I'm here. Something shifted slightly in the room. Not warmth exactly, not trust exactly, but the recognition of shared purpose between people who were approaching it from very different angles and with very different histories, and who were both clear-eyed about that. We need more witnesses, Sylvie said, practical as always. People from town who can corroborate what they saw 2 months ago. The sale, the paperwork, Peck operating in public. Hollis, Ronan said. The deputy. He's uncomfortable enough that he might be movable, given the right pressure. He knew the arrangements were wrong. He just didn't have anywhere to take that. He does now, Marin said. Gus at the saloon has seen everything, Ronan said. He won't put himself at risk. But he talks. When talking seems safe. What makes talking safe? Tessa asked. A crowd, Ronan said. People are brave in crowds when they weren't brave alone. If we can get enough people to the auction grounds, the crowd itself becomes the protection. He looked at Marin. Can Sylvie do that? Get people there without explaining why? Sylvie looked faintly offended at the suggestion that she couldn't. How much time do I have? This morning, Ronan said. I know that's... This morning, Sylvie repeated, as though she was testing the weight of it. There's an auction scheduled at midday, Ronan said. Briggs has a property transfer being formalized. He'll be there or he'll have representatives. Either way, the paperwork will be signed in public, which is the window. Then I have 4 hours, Sylvie said, and stood up and straightened her coat. Don't wait for me to come back. I'll come to you. She looked at Marin. Make sure Tessa's notebook is with us. It's always with me, Tessa said, slightly indignant. Sylvie almost smiled, touched Tessa's shoulder briefly, and walked out into the cold morning without another word. Marin watched her go, then she turned back to Ronan. One more thing, she said. If this goes wrong, if Duval or whoever Briggs has here decides to make a move before we can get everything into the open... She stopped. I need to know if you'll hold. He looked at her steadily. He didn't answer immediately, which was oddly reassuring. A man who answered immediately was performing something. I'll hold, he said, whatever that requires. Even if it costs you, Marin said. Not a challenge, just making sure the terms were clear. Especially if it costs me, he said, and something in the way he said it suggested he was not saying it to sound noble, but because it was a specific kind of debt he was paying, and he knew exactly what it was and wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Marin nodded once. She pulled the oilcloth package from her bag and unwrapped it carefully on the warped boards of the floor, laying out the ledger pages and the letter and Tessa's notebook pages. Everything they had, everything they'd been carrying since the morning she loaded 3 bags and walked out of the house she'd grown up in. She looked at it all spread out in the thin winter light. It was, she thought, both less and more than she'd expected. Less because it was just paper, just words and numbers, the fragile record of things that had been done to people who weren't supposed to matter. More because they were still here, she and Sylvie and Tessa, still standing, still moving, having gotten this far on nothing but stubbornness and anger and each other. Ronan crouched beside the papers and started going through them, and Tessa settled next to him with her notebook, and outside the frozen morning moved toward noon, and in 4 hours, maybe less, everything would either open or close for good. Marin put her hand flat on the cold floor, the same way she'd put it flat on the kitchen table when Peck came to their house with his pleasant smile and his manufactured debts, and felt the same thing she'd felt then, a cold refusal that had no bottom to it. She was not done yet, not even close. Sylvie had 4 hours and no reputation in Black Hollow anymore, or rather, she had the wrong kind of reputation, the kind that gets assigned to women who've been sold off and forgotten. She knew this walking into town. She also knew that reputation was a thing that could be reframed if you moved fast enough and hit the right rooms in the right order. She started with the women, not the respectable ones, not the merchants' wives who would need to consult their husbands before deciding what to think. She went to the laundry first, where 3 women worked in perpetual steam and noise and said more true things about Black Hollow in an hour than its men said in a month. She knew this from before, from the weeks before everything fell apart, when she'd carried their families washing down on Saturdays and stood in that hot room and listened. The woman who ran the laundry was named Bet, broad-shouldered and unsentimental, and she looked at Sylvie the way she looked at most things, with an assessment that was neither warm nor cold, just accurate. "Thought you were east of here," Bet said. "I was," Sylvie said. "Now I'm here. I need people at the auction grounds at midday." "For what?" "For Calhoun Briggs to answer for what he's done to this town," Sylvie said. She didn't dress it up. She decided on the walk, and that plain language was the only thing that would work with the time she had. "He had our father killed. He's stolen land from 4 families that I can name and probably more that I can't. He's running a scheme through Peck and the Land Authority that takes people's property the week after they die and puts the families in labor camps. And today, at noon, there's going to be a public proceeding at the auction grounds where that's going to be laid out in front of witnesses. Morshraskits yikakiten." Bet looked at her for a long moment. Steam rose between them from a tub of sheets. "And you think that matters," she said. "You think Briggs doesn't own the people running that proceeding?" "The proceeding is already scheduled," Sylvie said. "We're not the ones running it. We're just going to be there, with documentation, and a man who worked for Briggs directly and is willing to testify to his methods." She paused. "What matters is how many people see it. Briggs can bury a complaint. He can't bury a crowd." One of the other women, younger, Sylvie didn't know her name, had stopped working and was listening without pretending not to. Bet noticed and didn't tell her to get back to it, which told Sylvie something. "My husband lost half his contract last year," the younger woman said. "Briggs's men said he owed fees he'd never agreed to. He paid because we couldn't afford to fight it." "That's the pattern," Sylvie said. "He's been doing it for years. To small people, one at a time, because small people don't usually find each other." She looked at Bet. "Today they do." Bet dried her hands on her apron. She didn't say yes or no. She said, "I close at 11:30 on Saturdays anyway," and turned back to her work. Sylvie moved on. The feed store, where she spoke to the owner's son for 8 minutes and left him with a specific piece of information, that the deed to the Moreau property, currently in Briggs's name through a shell arrangement, had been filed using documents that had been fraudulently certified by a county recorder who was now prepared to say so publicly. The son's face went through several changes. His family had bought feed supplies from the Moreaus for 12 years. He said he'd close up for lunch. The barber shop, where 4 men were in various stages of being shaved, and all of them were listening while the barber pretended to focus on his work, and Sylvie spoke to the room generally about what was happening at the auction grounds at noon, and why anyone who'd ever felt the particular squeeze of Briggs's land arrangements might want to be present. One of the men in the chairs said, without moving because the barber had a razor at his jaw, "My brother-in-law lost his north pasture 2 years ago. Nobody could explain how. Suddenly, there were debts." He paused. "What time did you say?" "Noon," Sylvie said. "I'll be there," he said. "Don't cut me," he added to the barber. She went to Reverend Callum last, not because she'd forgiven him for the folded hands and the prayers that hadn't produced anything, but because she understood that he represented something, legitimacy, maybe, or at least the appearance of it, which was its own kind of useful. She found him in the small office behind the church, going over papers, and he looked up when she came in and had the grace to look genuinely uncomfortable. "Miss Vale," he said. He stood, which was something. "I didn't know you'd come back." "I need you at the auction grounds at noon," she said, "and I need you to understand that I'm not asking for your blessing or your opinion about whether what we're doing is wise. I'm asking you to stand in a public place and be a witness. That's all." Callum looked at his desk, then back at her. "What's happening at noon?" She told him. Shorter version this time, the bones of it, her father's death, the manufactured debts, Briggs's name on the land that should have passed to 3 daughters, the recorder who'd been taking money, the documentation. Callum listened with his hands still this time, not folded, just flat on the desk, and she could see him processing it with the expression of a man recalculating something he'd thought was already settled. "I prayed for your family," he said, when she finished. He said it not defensively, but with a kind of bleak honesty that surprised her. "I know you did," Sylvie said. "I'd rather have you at the auction grounds." He came. By the time Sylvie got back to the Moreau property to collect Marin and Ronan and Tessa, it was 11:15, and she was cold through to her bones, and her voice was rougher than it had been. She'd spoken to 14 separate people in 3 hours. She had no idea how many of them would actually show up. That was the part she couldn't control. "How'd it go?" Tessa asked, reading her face. "I don't know yet," Sylvie said honestly. "We'll find out at noon." They moved toward Black Hollow in a group, which felt strange after weeks of careful hiding. Strange to be walking openly toward the thing they'd been afraid of. Ronan walked slightly ahead, scanning the road in a way that had become automatic, and Marin walked with the oilcloth package held against her chest like she was carrying something that might break, which in a sense she was. Tessa was on Marin's left with her notebook, and Sylvie fell in beside Ronan because she wanted to understand the terrain before they entered it. "Duval?" she asked quietly. "Saw him this morning near the saloon," Ronan said. "He knows something's happening. He doesn't know what yet." "Briggs?" "His horse is at the livery. He came in last night. He's here for the property transfer. There's a parcel north of town going into his name today, through the auction. He'd want to be present for that." Ronan's jaw tightened slightly. He's not expecting this. He thinks we're either scattered or manageable. "Good," Sylvie said. "Let him think that until we're in the room." The auction grounds were at the north end of Black Hollow's main street, an open lot with a raised wooden platform that served as the official transaction stage for property sales, debt settlements, and any public legal proceeding that required witnessed signatures. It was not a grand space. The platform was weathered and one of its support posts leaned slightly. But it was public and official, and in a frontier town where so much happened in back rooms and private arrangements, the auction grounds were one of the few places where the law required things to happen in the open. They arrived at 20 minutes to noon. There were already people there. Not a crowd yet. Scattered individuals, people who'd heard from someone who'd heard from Sylvie's morning circuit, standing around in the cold with the slightly uncomfortable look of people who've come to something they're not sure about. Bet from the laundry was there with 2 of her workers, the feed store owner's son, the barber's customer with the brother-in-law's lost pasture, a handful of others Sylvie didn't recognize who must have come through someone else's chain of telling. More were coming. Sylvie could see them trickling in from the south end of the street, Individuals in pairs. That particular walk of people who are curious and worried and trying to look like they're just passing through. Marin stopped at the edge of the lot and looked at the platform and felt her heart doing something uncomfortable in her chest. Not fear exactly, more like the physical manifestation of understanding that there was no longer any possibility of going back. They'd left the Garrick Ranch. They'd come back to Black Hollow. Whatever happened in the next hour was going to happen. "Bertram Cole," she said to Ronan. "Is he here?" Ronan scanned the crowd. "Not yet." "You said he'd be here." "I said he'd be here," Ronan confirmed, without additional reassurance, which she respected more than false confidence would have been. They moved to the edge of the platform. The official auction proceedings wouldn't start until noon. There was a county representative who handled the formalities, a dry man named Ashworth, who Marin didn't know, already arranging papers on a small table on the platform's left side. He hadn't looked up yet. Calhoun Briggs was on the far side of the grounds. She recognized him from the way everyone else was oriented relative to him. The unconscious spatial deference of people in a powerful man's vicinity. The small adjustments of posture that money and threat produce in those around them. He was in his 50s, well-dressed for the frontier, with a broad face and the kind of physical confidence that came from never having been in a situation he couldn't buy his way out of. He was talking to two men she didn't know and hadn't looked at the platform yet. Duval was 15 feet behind him and to the left, and he was watching Ronan with the still expression of a man doing an internal calculation. Marin looked at all of this and then looked at her sisters. Tessa had her notebook out already. Sylvie was watching the crowd with the same focused look she used when she was listening to several conversations at once. "We have maybe 10 minutes before the official proceedings start," Marin said quietly. "Once Ashworth calls the session, we have to move." "I know," Ronan said. "If Briggs recognizes you before we're ready—" "He already has," Ronan said. "He's not looking at us, but he knows I'm here. Duval will have told him." He was very calm about this. Not the performed calm of someone pretending fear away, but the actual calm of someone who'd decided the math and accepted the outcome. It doesn't change anything. He can't move against us here without proving exactly what we're about to accuse him of. Unless he decides he doesn't care about that, Marin said. "Then that's also information," Ronan said. "In front of all these people." A hand touched Marin's arm. She turned. It was a man she didn't recognize, thin, 50s, with ink stains on his fingers, and the hunched posture of someone who spent their life at a desk. He had the look of a man who had not slept and was not entirely sure he was doing the right thing and was going to do it anyway. "Are you Marin Vale?" he said very quietly. "Yes," she said. "I'm Cole," he said. "Bertram Cole." He looked at Ronan with something between gratitude and resentment. The look of someone who knows they've been maneuvered into position and can't entirely complain because the position needed to be filled. "He said you had the original ledgers." "I have them," Marin said. "Then I need to see them before—" He stopped, looked at the platform, at Ashworth setting up. "Before this starts." She handed him the oilcloth package and watched him unwrap it with ink-stained fingers, watched him go through the pages with the quick, practiced eye of someone who knew what he was looking at. His face did something complicated. He stopped on one page and looked at it for a long time. "These filing numbers," he said, very quietly. "Yes," Marin said. "I certified these," Cole said. Not a confession exactly, more like a man saying aloud something he'd been carrying alone for a long time and finding that saying it out loud was both terrible and a relief. "Peck brought them to me with the payment, and I certified them. I knew they were manufactured. I told myself—" He stopped. "It doesn't matter what I told myself." "No," Marin agreed. "It doesn't. What matters is that you tell that to everyone here in about 8 minutes. Cole looked at her. He was frightened, clearly, genuinely frightened, his hands not entirely steady on the ledger pages. He was also, she thought, tired of being frightened. There was something in his face that recognized its own last chance when it saw one. "All right," he said. Ashworth was calling the session to order. The crowd had grown. Marin couldn't count heads, but there were more people than she'd dared hope. 40, maybe 50, crowded into the cold lot, more arriving from both ends of the street. She saw Reverend Callum near the back. She saw Gus from the saloon, standing with his arms crossed. She saw Deputy Hollis at the edge of the crowd with the expression of a man who had been told by his conscience to show up and was currently arguing with it about what came next. Briggs had moved closer to the platform. He'd seen Ronan now, seen all of them, and his face had gone through something and come out the other side into a flat, dangerous stillness. He said something low to one of the men beside him. Duval started moving through the crowd, working toward their position. "Ronan," Sylvie said quietly. "I see him," Ronan said. Ashworth was announcing the day's proceedings. A property transfer, the Vale debt settlement finalization, standard language. Marin listened for her family's name, and when Ashworth said the matter of the Vale estate debt, settled in favor of the creditor under filing number. "That filing is fraudulent," Marin said. She said it at full voice, clearly, so the whole lot could hear it. Not shouting. She'd learned from watching Peck that shouting made you look desperate, and she was not desperate. She was furious, which was different. Ashworth stopped. Every head in the crowd turned. "My name is Marin Vale," she said. She stepped forward to the edge of the platform. "The debt attached to my father's estate doesn't exist. It was manufactured by Aldous Peck on behalf of Calhoun Briggs in order to seize land my father refused to sell, and the county recorder who certified the filing documents is standing right here and is prepared to say so." The silence that followed was the particular kind that happens when a crowd realizes it has walked into a moment that matters. Briggs said from across the lot with remarkable composure, "Miss Vale, this is not the appropriate venue." "You made it the appropriate venue," Marin said, "when you scheduled a property transfer on land you took from a dead man's children." She looked at him across the crowd, really looked at him, the man whose name she'd been carrying for months like a stone in her pocket. He was not a monster. That was the thing. He was just a man who had looked at her family and decided they were manageable. "You were wrong about us," she said. "We would like to explain how wrong." Tessa was already moving through the crowd to Hollis, her notebook open to the pages she'd prepared, the careful, small handwriting of a 12-year-old who had understood what paying attention was worth. Sylvie had moved to a position where she could see both Duval and the crowd simultaneously, and she was watching Duval with the still, planted posture she'd used in the kitchen doorway on the day they'd refused to be separated. Duval reached Ronan and stopped. Up close, in daylight, with 50 people watching, the calculation was different than it had been in a saloon. Duval looked at Ronan and then at the crowd and then back at Ronan. "This is a mistake," he said quietly. "For somebody," Ronan agreed. Cole had climbed onto the platform. His voice shook when he started speaking and steadied as he went. The way voices do when the worst part, the beginning, is over. He had the filing numbers memorized. He had the dates. He explained, in the flat, specific language of a man who had kept meticulous records even of the things he was ashamed of, how the certification process worked, what Peck had brought him, what he had been paid, and how the resulting documents had been used to seize property from families with no legal resources to challenge them. The crowd was absolutely quiet. Marin stood on the platform beside Cole and watched the faces in the lot, and saw the things Sylvie had promised would happen. The particular alchemy of a crowd realizing it has been living inside someone else's lie. She could see it moving through the people, the shift from uncertainty to recognition to something harder and colder. The man with the brother-in-law's lost pasture, the young woman from the laundry, the feed store owner's son, people who had their own version of this story, smaller or larger, and who had been holding it alone because alone it went nowhere. Briggs made one move. He said loud enough to carry, "This is slander. This woman and her associates are making false accusations in a public forum, and I will hold every person here accountable." "You'll hold Harlan Vale accountable too?" Tessa's voice came from near Hollis, clear and carrying in the cold air. She was small and she was 12, and she sounded like neither. "You can find him at the bottom of the ravine behind his own property." The crowd heard this. The crowd understood what it meant. Hollis, standing next to Tessa, did the thing his conscience had been dragging him toward for 2 months. He raised his voice and said, loud enough for everyone, "I'm requesting a formal inquiry into the death of Harlan Vale and the land transactions conducted by the Black Hollow Land and Title Authority." He didn't look comfortable. He looked like a man who had finally done the thing he should have done earlier and was living with the fact that earlier would have been better. "I'm asking anyone with information to remain present." Briggs looked at Duval, Duval looked at Ronan. And what Duval saw in Ronan's face, or what he didn't see maybe, the absence of hesitation, made a decision for him, because he stepped back, and then he stepped back again. And then he was moving through the crowd toward the street, and the two men who'd been standing with Briggs were also moving. Briggs did not move. This surprised Marin for a half second, until she understood why. Running looked like guilt, and Calhoun Briggs had spent 30 years being the kind of man who did not run, who stood his ground behind the armor of his money and his legal machinery and made everyone else run instead. He stood in the auction lot and looked at Marin Vale with the expression of a man discovering that his armor had a gap in it he hadn't known was there. Marin looked back at him. She had stood at the bottom of the ravine where her father died and not screamed. She had sat across from Peck and held her voice level. She had slept on a hard floor for 2 months and worked someone else's land and written letters across a distance and dragged her sisters through snow on a logging trail in December. She was 20 pounds lighter than she'd been in October, and her knees still ached from the fall on the icy trail, and she hadn't cried in front of anyone since the morning she found her father because she hadn't been able to afford to. She looked at Calhoun Briggs across the frozen lot and felt the cold anger that had been living in her chest since October. Do something she hadn't expected. It didn't blaze up. It didn't become something dramatic. It just settled, quiet and permanent, into something that felt almost like stillness. He was just a man. He had done terrible things, and he was going to answer for them, and that was what mattered, not what she felt about it. Aldous Peck, she said, to the crowd, to Ashworth, who was standing frozen at his table with his papers, to Hollis, who was now writing in his own record book, to the 50 people in the lot who were watching with the focused attention of a community that has just understood what has been done to it. Operates out of an office on the east side of town. His files will contain documentation of every fraudulent claim filed in this county in the last 2 years. I suggest someone go get them before they're destroyed. 3 men from the crowd left immediately. She hadn't asked them to. They just went. Sylvie, watching this from her position on the lot's edge, felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for so long she'd stopped noticing it. Not relief. Relief was too simple for what this was. More like the first full breath after a very long time of breathing shallow. She found Tessa at her elbow, notebook clutched against her chest, watching the crowd with wide, exhausted eyes. "Are we okay?" Tessa asked, the way she only asked when she meant it. Sylvie put her arm around her sister's shoulders. "I think," she said carefully, because she was not someone who made promises she wasn't sure of. "We're going to be." On the platform, Marin was still standing. Her back hurt and her knee ached, and she was so tired she could feel it behind her eyes. But she stayed standing because there were still things to be done, people to speak to, records to ensure were properly documented, and because she had the particular stubbornness of a person who has committed to finishing a thing and doesn't know how to stop in the middle. Across the lot, Calhoun Briggs was being approached by Hollis, who had apparently found enough spine for at least this part of what came next. The crowd watched. The crowd stayed. That was the thing Briggs had miscalculated. Not Ronan, not the documentation, not even Marin's cold organizational fury. He'd miscalculated the crowd. He'd assumed Black Hollow would do what Black Hollow had always done, watch in silence and go home. He'd built his entire operation on that assumption. He'd been right about it, for years, until he wasn't. The 3 men who left the auction lot to find Peck's office came back 40 minutes later with 2 boxes of files and the information that Peck himself had already gone. Horse missing from the livery, room at the boarding house cleaned out, which told everyone present that Peck had been watching the auction grounds from somewhere and had understood what was happening before most of the crowd did. He was gone. That was a problem for later. What he'd left behind was not nothing. Hollis spent the rest of that afternoon at Ashworth's table on the platform, working through the files with Cole beside him, Cole's ink-stained finger moving down page after page identifying which certifications were legitimate and which weren't. It was slow and uncomfortable work, and nobody pretended otherwise. Ashworth, to his credit, did not leave. He sat at his table in the December cold and documented everything as it was identified, his hand moving steadily. A man who had spent his career processing transactions, now processing the undoing of them. Briggs had been formally detained. Hollis's word, careful and legalistic, because Hollis was a man who moved in the shelter of procedure even when finally doing the right thing. He wasn't in chains. He sat in the sheriff's office on a chair by the window with the particular stillness of a man who has spent 30 years being the one who makes decisions and is discovering, for the first time in a long time, that the decisions are being made around him. He said nothing. He'd said nothing since the lot, since Hollis approached him with the new, slightly unfamiliar spine he'd apparently grown in the previous hour. Marin didn't see this directly. She heard it from Ronan, who'd walked the perimeter of the situation the way he moved through most things, watching, noting, staying at the useful edge of events rather than the center. He came back to where Marin was sitting on the edge of the platform, finally sitting, her knee throbbing steadily and her voice gone rough from talking, and he said, "Briggs is in the office. Hollis is holding him pending a formal inquiry." "Pending," Marin said. "It's not a conviction," Ronan said, and he said it honestly because she'd asked him from the beginning not to manage what he told her. "It's a hold. There needs to be a county inquiry, and then a territorial proceeding, and it could take months. Briggs has money, and he'll have lawyers here within 2 weeks." Marin nodded slowly. She'd known this. The frontier was not a place where justice happened fast or clean. She'd built her expectations accordingly. "But the inquiry happens in public," she said. "Everything from today is in public record," Ronan confirmed. "Ashworth's documentation, Cole's testimony, the filing records from Peck's office. That's all formal record now. Briggs can hire lawyers, but he can't make any of that disappear." "And Duval?" "Gone," Ronan said. "Him and the other 2. I'd guess they're 2 counties over by nightfall." He paused. Duval's not a stupid man. He knew when to read the room. Marin looked at the lot, still dotted with people who hadn't left. Some still talking, some just standing in that way of people who aren't sure what to do with a thing they've just witnessed, but aren't ready to stop being in the presence of it. Betty from the laundry was deep in conversation with 2 women Marin didn't recognize. The feed store owner's son was talking to Hollis's deputy. Reverend Callum was standing with a small group near the platform's edge. And for once in Marin's experience of him, he was listening instead of speaking. "Pearl," Marin said, "and the other workers at the ranch. What happens to their arrangements now that the authorities' filing is being investigated?" Ronan was quiet for a moment. "That's going to need someone to push it through formally," he said. "The arrangements were legal in structure, even if the foundation was fraudulent. It won't automatically dissolve." "Then someone pushes it through formally," Marin said. "You're thinking about that already," Ronan said. "Not a criticism, just noting it." "I've been thinking about it since October," Marin said. She looked at her hands in her lap, rough now in a way they hadn't been before. The hands of someone who'd spent 2 months doing hard labor. "There are other families. We're not the only ones. Getting the inquiry opened is the start, not the end." Sylvie appeared from the crowd and sat beside Marin on the platform edge, and for a moment neither of them said anything, which was its own kind of conversation between sisters who'd been through the same months and didn't need to narrate it. Then Sylvie said, "Dort's nephew, from the print shop." Marin looked at her. "What about him?" "He came," Sylvie said. "He's been here the whole time. He has original print templates that match Peck's documents. He didn't come forward on his own, but he came. He told me he's willing to put it in writing if the inquiry requests it." She paused. "He was scared. He's still scared, but he came." Marin thought about this, about a frightened man from a print shop who had come to a public proceeding and stood in the cold and watched, and eventually decided that being a witness was something he could do. She thought about Hollis growing a spine at the last possible moment, about Cole's shaking hands steadying as he spoke, about the 3 men who'd gone to get Peck's files without being asked. People were not good or bad the way stories made them out to be. They were mostly scared, and scared people did terrible things, and small things, and sometimes, when circumstances and crowd and moment aligned just right, they did the thing they should have done earlier. It wasn't heroism. It was just people catching up to themselves. "Good," Marin said. "Tell him the inquiry will want him." Tessa found them at the end of the afternoon, coming through the thinning crowd with her notebook and her exhausted eyes, and a look that was trying to be composed and mostly succeeding. She sat between her sisters without ceremony, the way she always sat between them, and the 3 of them were quiet for a moment on the platform edge, while the winter light went gray around them, and the last of the crowd drifted away and Black Hollow settled into the strange, shell-shocked quiet of a town that has just had something it thought was solid turn out to be built on hollow ground. "Is it done?" Tessa asked. "The beginning is done," Marin said. Tessa accepted this with the particular maturity of a child who has been forced by circumstances to understand that things don't resolve the way they do in the stories she read by candlelight, all at once, cleanly, with everyone in their correct place at the end. "Okay," she said. Then after a pause, "My knee is cold." Sylvie put her arm around Tessa and Marin leaned into her other side, the three of them on the edge of the platform in the fading afternoon, and for a few minutes it was just that. Three sisters, cold and tired, sitting together in the town that had let them be sold and had now watched the thing that had sold them start to come apart. It wasn't a triumphant feeling. It was more complicated than that, and more honest. The inquiry took 11 weeks. It was not a clean or simple process. Briggs's lawyers arrived from the territorial capital within 10 days. Two sharp men in good coats who immediately began working to narrow the scope of the proceedings and challenge the admissibility of Cole's testimony on the grounds of his own admitted complicity. The challenge failed, but it slowed things down. Peck was located in a town 3 counties west, brought back under protest, and proved to be a man whose self-preservation instinct, when it finally had nowhere left to go, expressed itself as extremely detailed testimony about the operational structure of everything he'd done for Briggs and how he'd done it. Peck was many things. He was not, in the end, loyal. The Moreau family, or what remained of them, a grown son who'd been working a ranch in the South and a daughter who'd married and moved east, were located and brought into the proceedings. The son, a quiet man named Henri, who had the particular closed-off expression of someone who has swallowed grief for a long time without a place to put it, sat across from Marin in a cold room in the county courthouse and said, "Our father didn't have an accident either." "I know," Marin said. "Can you prove it?" "We're working on it," she said. "Peck's testimony covers the operational side. Cole's records show the financial trail. The gap is the physical. Who was in that county, when, and on whose instruction?" Henri looked at her steadily. "There was a man," he said. "Big, moved quiet. Came to our property 3 days before our father was found." He stopped. "I was 16. I didn't understand what I was seeing." Marin thought about Ronan, about the family in Hardin County he'd mentioned, where he'd stopped something, but not everything. "Can you describe him?" Henri described someone who was not Ronan. Someone whose description Ronan, when Marin brought it to him that evening, identified without hesitation. A man who'd worked enforcement for Briggs's firm 2 years before Ronan had, gone by the name Garrett, and whose current whereabouts Ronan thought he could track. "You don't have to do that," Marin said. "I know," Ronan said, the same way he'd said especially if it costs me in the rotting storage building on the Moreau property, with the same quality of a man who has decided what his debts are and is going to pay them. He tracked Garrett in 3 weeks. What Garrett said, when he was found and understood that Peck was already talking and the structure around him had collapsed, was enough to close the evidentiary gap on both Harlan Vale's death and the Moreau patriarchs. It wasn't a confession delivered to a judge in a proper courtroom. It was a statement made to a territorial marshal in a cold room in a border town, taken down in writing, signed, and sent back to the Black Hollow Inquiry by horse courier. When Marin read the statement, the bare, specific language of it, the dates and instructions, and what had actually happened at the bottom of a ravine on a morning in October, she sat with it for a long time by herself. She'd known. She'd known since the first week. But knowing and reading it written down in someone else's hand were different things, and she allowed herself a few minutes of something that had been waiting for a long time to happen, private and ugly and real. And then she put it away and went back to the work. Calhoun Briggs was convicted on 7 counts of land fraud, 2 counts of conspiracy to commit murder, and a collection of smaller charges related to the operation of the Land and Title Authority as a criminal enterprise. His lawyers fought every count. They won on 2 of the smaller charges, which was the part that made Marin's jaw tighten when she heard it. The specific, particular injustice of a powerful man losing most of the battle and still winning a little of it through sheer financial persistence. That was how it worked. She'd known that going in. She held on to what had actually been accomplished and refused to let the 2 losses hollow it out. Briggs was sentenced to 14 years. He served 11, but his land empire collapsed within 8 months of the conviction. the shell companies unwound, the fraudulent titles vacated, the properties returned through a lengthy legal process that required Marin to become, over the following 2 years, considerably more proficient in territorial property law than she had ever expected to be. The Vale land came back first. That was the county's concession to the visible injustice of it. The fact that these 3 women had been living on their own father's land before any of this happened, and the first thing Harlan Vale's estate should have been paying was the debt Briggs had manufactured to take it. It was returned by formal county order 7 months after the inquiry closed. A document delivered to the Vale house, still standing, unoccupied since October, cold and dusty and waiting, by a county clerk who looked like he wasn't entirely sure what to do with the occasion. Marin signed for it at the kitchen table, the same table where Peck had once opened his satchel, and explained to her that everything was in order. She didn't say anything particularly memorable about the moment. She signed the paper and thanked the clerk and closed the door and stood in her father's kitchen with the document in her hands and looked at the room, the stove, the shelves, the window where the light came in at a particular angle in the afternoon, and felt the strange, incomplete texture of getting back something that should never have been taken, which is not the same feeling as getting something new. Nothing about her father was in that document. Nothing about the months since October was undone by it. But the land was theirs again, and it was solid under her feet, and she needed that to be enough for right now. Sylvie and Tessa arrived an hour later, having heard the news from Hollis, who'd heard from the clerk. They came in without knocking because it was their house, and they hadn't needed to knock at their own house since they were children. And Sylvie looked at the document on the table and at Marin's face and said, "You okay?" "I'm working on it," Marin said. Tessa went directly to her old room and came back with the expression of someone checking that something is still where they left it. "My books are still here," she announced, as though this were the most important piece of information available. "Of course they are," Sylvie said. Nobody wanted Tessa's books. "Lots of people would want my books," Tessa said with dignity. Sylvie laughed. It was the first time Marin had heard her laugh like that, freely, without the careful management that had been on everything for months. And the sound of it in that kitchen was the most normal thing Marin had experienced since October, and it caught her off guard in a way that made her eyes do something embarrassing. She turned toward the window until she had herself sorted. The plan for the land had been forming in Marin's head for a long time, since the Garrick Ranch, since Pearl and her 2 years of labor arrangements, since the Calloway family's son and Henri Moreau and every other person whose story had emerged through the inquiry, like something that had been underground for a long time finally coming into the light. The northern edge of the Vale property was large enough, 40 acres of it that Harlan had never fully developed, rougher ground, but buildable. There was water access. There was the old equipment barn that could be converted. She talked to Sylvie about it in fragments over the months, assembling the idea between other things, testing it. Sylvie had added pieces, practical things, operational things, the kind of thinking that Marin generated and Sylvie refined and Tessa documented with her small, careful handwriting in a notebook that had expanded to 3 notebooks by the time the inquiry closed. They called it a refuge for lack of a better word, not an institution, not a charity, both of which implied a relationship of power that Marin was constitutionally uninterested in. What they wanted was a place where women in the situation they'd been in had somewhere to go. Labor arrangements gone wrong. Displacement. Widows with contested estates. Women who had the particular problem of being female on a frontier that had decided female meant manageable. They had Pearl already, who came as soon as she heard, who walked through the door of the Vale house with 2 bags and the same businesslike expression she'd worn at the Garrick Ranch, and said, "I know how to run a kitchen for 12 people. Tell me where you want to start." They started with the barn. It took the better part of a year to make the north property habitable. Marin handled the legal structures, property agreements, the formal establishment of what eventually became recorded as the Vale Land Cooperative, a structure that Dort's nephew helped her navigate through the county recorder's office with a different clerk than Cole, who was serving a reduced sentence in exchange for his testimony. Sylvie managed the building work and the people, which turned out to be the same skill set applied in different directions. Her ability to read a room, to find the useful contribution in each person, to smooth the friction between individuals without making anyone feel managed. Workers came from the ranches where the inquiry had dissolved fraudulent labor arrangements. Some stayed, some moved on. Both was fine. Tessa was 16 by the time the first three women arrived who weren't the Vale sisters or Pearl. She was also, by then, the most complete record keeper in the county. Her notebooks had been cited in 2 territorial legal proceedings as documentation of events at the Garrick Ranch, and a lawyer from the capital had asked, with visible respect, who had prepared the materials. Hollis, who'd been present, said the name, and the lawyer looked at Tessa, who was 15 at the time, and had the decency to appear appropriately surprised. She was not sweet about it. She was Tessa. Ronan stayed in Black Hollow through the inquiry. After the conviction, he disappeared for a few months. Marin got one letter from a town she'd never heard of, no explanation of what he was doing there, just a brief note saying the territory was less ugly than it used to be from the vantage point of having occasionally been the thing making it ugly, which she understood was his version of saying he was processing something. She wrote back a single line. Progress is not the same as absolution. But it's not nothing either. He came back in the spring. He didn't make an announcement about it. He appeared in Black Hollow one Tuesday morning, horse-rested, coat less worn than before, and he went to the saloon and had coffee, which was where Sylvie found him because Sylvie always knew where people were before they told her. She sat across from him and looked at him for a moment. "You came back," she said. "I said I would," he said. "You said a lot of things," she said, which was what she'd said about him to Marin in the kitchen at the Garrick Ranch the first time his name came up, and she said it now with a different quality. Not suspicion, just the acknowledgement that she'd said it and had been wrong about what it meant. He came out to the Vale property that afternoon. Marin was in the north field, arguing with a post that had gone in at the wrong angle, and she didn't stop arguing with the post when she heard him come up because the post needed dealing with, and Ronan could wait 30 seconds. When she finally turned around, she looked at him and he looked at her and she said, "We could use someone who knows the county's back roads and which ranches are still operating on fraudulent labor arrangements." "That's a job description," he said. "It's an offer," she said, "if you want it." He looked at the north field, at the barn conversion in progress, at the Vale house with its smoke coming from the chimney, at Tessa visible in the distance carrying something large that she probably should have had help with. He looked at what these 3 women had built from the wreckage of October, which was imperfect and unfinished and very much alive. "I want it," he said. He was not redeemed by this. That was the truth of it, and Marin understood it, and she thought Ronan understood it too. That you don't work enforcement for a man like Briggs for 3 years and then do some good work and call the ledger clean. The ledger was not clean. It would not be clean. What you did with that was either let it make you useless or let it make you useful. And Ronan had made his choice, which was not a transformation so much as a direction. He was not the hero of this story. The Vale sisters were not heroes either, in the way the word usually got used. They were 3 women who had been pushed past what they thought they could survive and had survived it anyway, with all the damage and mess that entailed. Marin had nightmares she didn't talk about. Sylvie had a careful, guarded quality around strangers that hadn't been there before October. Tessa had grown up faster than she should have, and sometimes, in unguarded moments, she looked older than 16 in a way that wasn't entirely about wisdom. None of that went away. None of it was supposed to. What they had, instead of the clean resolution of a thing neatly finished, was this: land that was theirs. A north field going in for spring planting. Pearl in a kitchen that could feed 12. 3 notebooks full of documentation that were already being studied by a territorial lawyer working to establish legal protections for widows' estates across 4 counties. A former frontier enforcer who knew the back roads and the names. A town that had watched itself be exposed and was still deciding what to do with what it had seen, which was slow, as towns always are, but which was moving. They were not untouchable in the way that wealth makes people untouchable. They were untouchable in a different way. The way of people who have already lost everything and found out they're still standing, which gives you a particular kind of ground to stand on that nothing can be offered or threatened to remove. Hollis came out to the north property one afternoon in late spring, hat in hand, which was not his natural posture. Marin met him at the gate. He'd spent the winter being the kind of deputy who did the work he should have done in October, which was not nothing and was not enough. And he seemed to know both things and to be living in the uncomfortable space between them. "The county commissioner wants to know," he said, "whether the Vale Cooperative will put a representative on the Land Dispute Review Board. New board. Part of the reforms coming out of the inquiry. Marin looked at him. Which veil? Any of you, he said. Or all three? The commissioner said. He paused, with the expression of a man quoting something that surprised him. That he'd rather have people who know what the system looks like from the outside than people who've only ever worked inside it. Marin thought about Tessa's notebooks, about Sylvie's ability to read a room, about the stack of cases already coming in from women who'd heard about the cooperative through networks of word and whisper that spread faster on the frontier than any official communication. We'll send Tessa, she said. Hollis blinked. She's 16. She's also the most thorough researcher in the county, Marin said. You cited her documentation in 2 proceedings. The commissioner's welcome to meet with her and decide for himself. The commissioner met with Tessa the following week. He was a man in his 60s who had navigated territorial politics long enough to know competence when he saw it regardless of its packaging, and by the end of the hour he'd stopped talking to Tessa like she was 16. She came home with a formal appointment letter and the slightly stunned expression of someone who has discovered that the world occasionally, unexpectedly, catches up to what it should have been doing all along. She held up the letter. They want me on the board, she said. I know, Marin said. I'm 16, Tessa said. I know, Marin said again. Tessa looked at the letter for another moment. Then she went to get a new notebook. The last evening of that spring, the 3 of them sat on the porch of the Vale house, their father's house, theirs, and watched the light go down over the north field and the mountains behind it. It was the kind of evening the frontier produced sometimes, almost against its own nature. Soft light, still air, the land settling into dark without any particular drama. Pearl had left food on the table inside. Somewhere in the distance, a horse moved in the paddock that Ronan had put up the previous month. Do you think he knows? Tessa said, after a while. She didn't say who. She didn't need to. Marin looked at the mountains. She thought about a man she'd loved who had been careful about money and kept bad ledgers and raised 3 daughters without complaint on a stretch of rocky land nobody else had wanted. She thought about a letter he'd written that had taken 11 days to find the right person, and about what those 11 days had cost. She thought about ravines and missing boots, and the particular cruelty of a world that allows the Aldous Pecks and the Calhoun Briggses to move through it so smoothly for so long before anyone makes it stop. She thought about what it meant to be sitting here now, on this porch, with this land behind them and this future in front of them that was imperfect and unfinished and full of work that needed doing, and whether any of that was something Harlan Vale would have recognized as the thing he'd been trying to build when he registered the deed and planted the first crop and stayed, when it was hard because it was his and it was theirs. Yes, she said. She didn't know if she believed it. She knew it was what she needed to say, not because it was comforting, but because it was the only answer that honored the question properly. Tessa nodded, satisfied. Sylvie said nothing, which was her version of the same answer. The light finished going down. The mountains went dark. Inside, the food on the table got cold, which was fine because none of them were in a hurry. They had time now. They had built themselves time, which was a different thing than having it given to you, harder won and less comfortable and considerably more real. They were not the women they had been in October. They were not the women they would be in 5 years. They were somewhere in the middle of becoming, which is where most people live most of the time, and it wasn't beautiful or resolved or finished, but they were home, and no one was going to sell them again.